There are things that happen in this world that the official record cannot explain. Not because the people investigating them were incompetent. Not because the evidence was insufficient. Not because science had not yet developed the tools to find the answer. But because some events exist in a category that investigation itself seems unable to enter. Events where the more carefully you look, the less you understand. The deeper you go into the documentation, the more clearly you see the shape of something that has no name in any language that exists. We are not talking about folklore tonight. We are not talking about legends that grew in the dark in the distance of centuries until they outgrew the ordinary facts that originally produced them. We are talking about documented events. Events with witnesses. Events with official investigations, government reports, physical evidence, and in some cases the testimony of trained professionals, soldiers, scientists, pilots, emergency responders, people whose entire professional identity is built on the accurate observation and reporting of what they actually saw. People who, in some cases, lost careers, reputations, and sleep over what they could not explain. 7 events. 7 moments where the world revealed something about itself that it has never fully explained. We begin not with the most famous, but with the one that most people have never heard of, because it is the one that the record tried hardest to make dissipate. In September 1952, in the small town of Flatwoods in Braxton County, West Virginia, a group of boys playing on a hilltop saw something streaking across the evening sky and fall into the woods on a nearby farm. It glowed. It moved in a way that meteors do not move. The boys ran to tell their mother, Kathleen May, and she went with them and a local National Guardsman named Eugene Lemon to investigate. What they found at the site is described in their accounts with a consistency that investigators who studied the case later found difficult to dismiss. A large pulsing red light near the ground. A smell so sharp and acrid that several members of the group became physically ill within hours. And a figure. A tall figure. At least 10 feet by multiple accounts, with a dark body and a face that Kathleen May described as glowing. It moved toward them. Lemon shone his flashlight at it and the group ran. Within hours, several of them were vomiting. Lemon suffered from convulsions. A local doctor who examined them reported symptoms consistent with exposure to a chemical irritant. An Air Force investigation was launched under Project Blue Book and concluded the group had seen an owl in a tree combined with a meteor and the power of suggestion. The explanation was offered with the confident brevity of a conclusion determined before the investigation began. Kathleen May gave interviews about what she saw for the rest of her life. She never changed a single detail. The Flatwoods event sits at the intersection of mass witness testimony, documented physical symptoms, and an official explanation so inadequate it raises more questions than it answers. It is not famous enough to have been fully mythologized, which means the core of what the witnesses actually reported has survived relatively intact. What they reported does not have a satisfactory explanation. We move forward in time and backward in scale, from a hillside in West Virginia to the North Atlantic Ocean, to one of the most systematically strange stretches of water on the planet. The Bermuda Triangle has been explained so many times that the explanations have become their own genre of literature. Magnetic anomalies, methane eruptions from the ocean floor, human error amplified by treacherous weather. The Lloyd's of London insurer famously does not charge extra premiums for ships crossing it, and this fact is cited as evidence that nothing unusual happens there. What the dismissive accounts tend to leave out is the specificity of sight and disappearances that do not fit neatly into any of the offered explanations. On December 5, 1945, Flight 19, a group of 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers on a routine training mission, disappeared over the Atlantic northeast of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 14 men, 5 aircraft. The training mission was led by an experienced instructor, Lieutenant Charles Taylor. The weather at departure was clear. The aircraft were functioning normally at takeoff. What was captured in the radio transmissions from the flight in its final hours is something that has never been satisfactorily resolved. Taylor reported that his compass was behaving strangely. He reported that the ocean below did not look as it should. He reported that he was not certain which direction was west. The transmissions grew increasingly distressed, not with the specific distress of a mechanical emergency or deteriorating weather, but with the specific distress of a man who could not determine where he was despite every instrument and every piece of training telling him he should be able to. A rescue flying boat sent to find them also disappeared. 13 more men. No wreckage from any of the 6 aircraft was ever conclusively identified. The official explanation is pilot error combined with adverse weather conditions. The weather conditions had changed, that much is true. But the specific character of Taylor's transmissions, the confusion about basic orientation, the sense that the environment around the aircraft was not behaving as it should sits in the record and resists the tidy framing of pilot error. Some things disappear. Some things disappear in ways that suggest the disappearance itself has a shape. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. We move from the ocean to a forest in the Soviet Union, to one of the most exhaustively documented and completely unresolved events in the history of outdoor fatalities. On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers died on a slope of the Ural Mountains in circumstances that the lead investigator described in his official report as an unknown compelling force. Their names are known: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonyshenko, Alexander Zolotayev, Ludmila Dubinova, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignolel. Experienced hikers, people who knew what they were doing in extreme winter conditions. Their tent was found cut open from the inside, not torn, not collapsed, cut from the inside, with deliberate force. All 9 had fled into the negative 27-degree night, in their sleeping clothes, without boots. Several of them had climbed a tree nearby with enough force to strip the bark from the upper branches with their bare hands before dying of hypothermia. But hypothermia alone does not explain everything. 3 of the 9 had internal injuries, broken ribs, a fractured skull that the medical examiner described as consistent with the force of a car crash, with no external bruising whatsoever. No external bruising, the kind of internal traumatic injury that requires massive force, but with no marks on the skin. 1 hiker's tongue was missing. 2 of the bodies were found with clothing that tested positive for radiation at levels that required explanation. The Soviet government classified the investigation. The case was reopened by Russian authorities in 2019 and officially attributed to an avalanche, a conclusion that the physical evidence, the uphill trajectory of the fleeing hikers, the absence of avalanche debris at the tent site, and the specific distribution of the bodies has been challenged by multiple independent investigators. The Dyatlov Pass incident has generated more serious academic investigation than almost any other unexplained event of the 20th century. It has not generated a satisfactory explanation. What it has generated is a consistent, documented, carefully preserved record of 9 people who experienced something on a mountain in February 1959 that caused them to do things that experienced hikers in full possession of their faculties would never do, and then killed them in ways that the available explanations cannot fully account for. The mountain is still there. It still has its original name in the local Monsi language, Kolatsayakal. It means dead mountain. We crossed from the Soviet Union to the Republic of Zimbabwe, to a school in the town of Ruwa, to a morning in September 1994 that produced one of the most extensively documented mass witness events in the modern record. Ariel School was a primary school with approximately 62 students aged 6 to 12. On the morning of September 16, 1994, during a morning break when the teachers were inside attending a meeting, the children were playing on the school grounds when they observed a craft land in a field near the school boundary. What followed has been studied by researchers including Dr. John Mack, a Harvard psychiatrist and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, who interviewed the children individually over the following weeks and found their accounts consistent with each other in ways he described as extraordinary given their ages and the absence of any coordinated opportunity to align their stories. The children described figures near the craft. They described communication that was not verbal, a sense of being looked at in a way that communicated something directly. Several of the children drew pictures of what they had seen that showed a remarkable consistency across subjects who were interviewed separately. The older children were visibly distressed in ways that Dr. Mack described as consistent with genuine traumatic experience rather than excited fabrication. The BBC interviewed the children on camera. The footage exists. The children, now adults, have maintained their accounts. No conventional explanation of mass hysteria, misidentified aircraft, and deliberate fabrication has been demonstrated to account for the specific consistency of the accounts across 62 witnesses of varying ages interviewed separately. Dr. Mack returned to Zimbabwe multiple times. He was convinced that something had happened at Ariel School on September 16, 1994. He was not able to determine what. Neither has anyone else. We moved from Zimbabwe to the Pacific Ocean, to an event that involves not children but military professionals, trained observers with classified clearances, operating the most sophisticated sensor equipment available to the United States Navy. In November 2004, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was operating off the coast of San Diego when its advanced radar systems detected objects exhibiting flight characteristics that its operators initially assumed indicated equipment malfunction. The objects were moving at speeds that the systems had no category for. They were descending from extremely high altitudes to near sea level in seconds. They were hovering. They were accelerating and decelerating in ways that violated the physics of any known aircraft. Pilots were scrambled to investigate. Commander David Fravor, a highly experienced combat pilot, made visual contact with one of the objects. What he observed has been described by him in numerous subsequent interviews with a specificity and consistency that his professional colleagues have found credible. A white tic-tac-shaped object, approximately 40 feet long, with no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no exhaust. It responded to his approach by mirroring his movements. When he attempted to close with it, it accelerated away at a speed he described as unlike anything he had ever seen. The thermal camera footage from the encounter was subsequently released by the U.S. Department of Defense and confirmed as authentic. The footage shows objects exhibiting the flight characteristics the pilots described. In 2020, the Pentagon officially acknowledged the footage and the encounters, confirming that the objects were unidentified and that their flight characteristics remain unexplained by any technology currently acknowledged to exist. Commander Fravor continues to give interviews. His account has not changed. Other pilots involved in the encounter have corroborated his description. The Pentagon's acknowledgement represents something significant. The official position of the United States government is that these objects were real, were observed by trained military personnel using multiple independent sensor systems, and have not been explained. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. We come now to an event that most people have heard of but few people have examined at the level of detail that the detail deserves. On the night of June 30th, 1908, something entered the atmosphere above Siberia and exploded approximately 5 to 10 kilometers above the Tunguska River. The explosion flattened approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest and 80 million trees in a radial pattern consistent with an airburst detonation. Windows were broken 800 kilometers away. The atmospheric shockwave was recorded by barometers across Europe and Asia. The night skies over Europe glowed with unusual brightness for several days afterward. No crater was ever found. No meteorite fragments of any significant size were ever conclusively identified at the site. The explosion left no solid remnant at the epicenter, only flattened trees pointing outward from a central point in all directions like the spokes of a wheel. The conventional scientific explanation is a comet or asteroid that exploded on atmospheric entry before reaching the ground, leaving no solid debris. This explanation is scientifically credible and widely accepted. What makes Tunguska genuinely strange is not the event itself, but the specificity of certain peripheral details that the conventional explanation leaves unaddressed. Witnesses from local Evenki communities described not just a fireball and an explosion, but a sequence of events, sounds, atmospheric disturbances, the behavior of local animals in the days before the event that do not fit neatly into the meteor or comet model. Expeditions to the site in the following decades found anomalies in the soil composition and accelerated plant growth at the epicenter that some researchers have attributed to radiation. Tunguska was the most powerful explosion in recorded human history not attributable to a volcanic eruption. It occurred over one of the most remote inhabited areas of the planet. If it had occurred 4 hours later, the rotation of the Earth would have placed St. Petersburg directly in its path. The trees at the epicenter were still standing, stripped of every branch, standing perfectly upright at the point directly below the explosion, while every tree for miles around them lay flat. They looked, according to the researchers who reached them, like a forest of telegraph poles, standing in the silence of the blast zone, pointing at the sky, with nowhere left to fall. We end where perhaps all such lists should end. Not in the sky or the ocean or the forest, but in a laboratory, in a controlled scientific environment, in the most peer-reviewed and rigorously tested phenomenon in modern physics, the double-slit experiment. If you are not familiar with it, the description sounds simple. A beam of particles, electrons, photons, individual quantum units of matter and energy is fired at a barrier with two narrow slits. Behind the barrier is a screen that records where the particles land. When both slits are open and no one is measuring which slit each particle passes through, the particles create an interference pattern on the screen, the pattern of waves, not particles. They behave as though each individual particle passed through both slits simultaneously. When a measurement device is added to determine which slit the particle passes through, the interference pattern disappears. The particles behave as particles again, as though the act of observation has changed the fundamental nature of what is being observed. This is not a fringe finding. This is the most tested, most replicated, most rigorously verified result in the history of experimental physics. It is the foundation of quantum mechanics, which underlies every piece of technology you are using to watch this video. The scientists who work with this result every day have not resolved its implications. The Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, the pilot wave theory, these are not answers to what the double-slit experiment reveals. They are different ways of not being able to answer it, each with its own philosophical costs. The implication that the experiment produces, stripped of the mathematical framework that usually insulates us from it, is this. At the fundamental level of physical reality, matter does not have definite properties until it is observed. The act of observation, the presence of a measuring consciousness, changes what matter does. Physics, the hardest of the hard sciences, has arrived at a result that the mystics of every tradition would recognize immediately and that the materialist framework of modern thought has no adequate response to. The universe behaves differently when it is being watched. We do not know what that means. We know that it is true. 7 events. A hillside in West Virginia where a woman described a figure that should not exist and whose symptoms were documented by a doctor. The North Atlantic where 5 aircraft vanished with transmissions that described not mechanical failure but the failure of orientation itself. A mountain in the Ural Range where 9 experienced hikers fled their tent in the middle of a Siberian night and died in ways that the available explanations have not accounted for. School in Zimbabwe, where 62 children described something that a Harvard psychiatrist spent years investigating without finding a conventional explanation. A patch of ocean off San Diego where trained military pilots observed objects whose flight characteristics have been officially confirmed as unexplained by the Pentagon. A Siberian river basin where the most powerful explosion in recorded human history left the trees at its epicenter standing while flattening everything around them. And a laboratory where the most tested experiment in physics has produced a result that no one can explain. None of these events are folklore. All of them have records. All of them have witnesses. Most of them have official investigations. None of them have satisfactory explanations. The world is stranger than the version of it that fits inside the frameworks we use to understand it. The evidence for this is not the province of the credulous or the imagination of the frightened. The evidence is in the official record, in the peer-reviewed journals, in the declassified government files, in the footage released by the Pentagon and the testimony of commanders who have spent their careers in the service of precise, verified, documented truth. Something is happening in the margins of what we can explain. It has always been happening. We are just beginning, very slowly, to admit that we can see it. The stories in this video are not anomalies to be filed away and forgotten. They are invitations. Invitations to sit with uncertainty honestly, to resist the comfort of explanations that are offered too quickly and too cleanly, to stay in the difficult and genuinely interesting place where the evidence ends and the question begins. That is where the real history lies. That is where we live. New dark history every week on Grimveil Epoch. Subscribe so you never miss the next story that the official record tried to leave behind. The buried do not always stay buried, and neither do the questions they carry with them.